In 1943, the USS Eldridge allegedly vanished from a naval shipyard in Philadelphia, teleported to Norfolk, Virginia, then reappeared with crew members fused into the ship's metal hull. Officially, this never happened, but the witness accounts exist, the documents exist, and the questions remain. These aren't just ethical violations. These are experiments that allegedly broke the laws of physics, shattered human psychology, or revealed truths so disturbing they were immediately classified. Some changed what we know about reality. Others changed what we're willing to do to understand it. Welcome to the Case Files. Let's investigate what should have remained forbidden. The Philadelphia Experiment. October 28, 1943. World War II. The United States Navy is desperately seeking any advantage against German U-boats. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, the USS Eldridge becomes the test subject for a radical experiment, using powerful electromagnetic fields to achieve invisibility. According to the legend, the experiment worked. Too well. The destroyer escort didn't just become invisible to radar, it vanished completely. Witnesses reported seeing the ship disappear in a flash of blue light, then instantaneously appear in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away. Moments later, it reappeared in Philadelphia, but the crew paid a horrifying price. Some sailors were found embedded in the ship's metal structure, their bodies fused with steel bulkheads as if they'd been teleported into solid matter. Others suffered severe mental disturbances, disorientation, and what the reports described as deep freeze, a condition where they'd phase in and out of visibility. Several crew members allegedly went insane. Some vanished and were never seen again. A few reportedly achieved involuntary invisibility for the rest of their lives. The Navy denies this ever happened. Official records show the USS Eldridge was nowhere near Philadelphia on that date, but the accounts persist. Carlos Allende, a merchant marine who claimed to witness the event, wrote detailed letters about it in the 1950s. Other sailors came forward with corroborating stories. What makes this experiment particularly disturbing is that it allegedly built on real science. The Navy was indeed researching degaussing, reducing a ship's magnetic signature to avoid magnetic mines. But did they stumble onto something far more dangerous? Unified field theory, a way to manipulate space-time itself. If the Philadelphia experiment happened, it suggests that in 1943, the military briefly achieved teleportation and invisibility, and then immediately classified it so deeply that even today, over 80 years later, the truth remains buried. The Montauk Project. If the Philadelphia experiment opened a door, the Montauk Project allegedly walked through it. Camp Hero, a decommissioned Air Force base on Long Island, New York, 1970s through 1983. According to whistleblowers, this is where the government continued the research that began in Philadelphia. The Montauk Project allegedly involved psychological warfare, time travel, and contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. The story comes primarily from Preston Nichols and Al Bielek, who claim to have worked on the project and recovered suppressed memories years later. Here's what they alleged. Researchers used powerful electromagnetic fields to manipulate human consciousness. They could implant thoughts, create false memories, and control behavior at a distance. They recruited psychically gifted individuals, often children, and amplified their abilities through technology. But the experiments went further. According to the accounts, they opened portals through time. They sent objects and people forward and backward through temporal vortexes. They made contact with non-human entities. And they created something called the Montauk chair, a device that could materialize thoughts into physical reality. The project allegedly ended catastrophically in 1983, when a test subject in the Montauk chair manifested a creature from his subconscious, a monster that began destroying the facility. Researchers were forced to shut down the equipment, collapsing the portal and ending the experiments. The evidence is circumstantial but persistent. Camp Hero exists. It has extensive underground facilities. Strange electromagnetic anomalies have been detected in the area, and multiple witnesses have come forward with similar stories, despite never having met each other. Skeptics point out that recovered memories are unreliable and that the entire story might be an elaborate conspiracy theory. Project MKUltra. This one isn't legend, it's documented fact. From 1953 to 1973, the CIA conducted illegal experiments on American and Canadian citizens, testing mind control techniques through drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture. The project began as an attempt to develop interrogation methods and create Manchurian candidates, assassins who could be programmed and triggered with no memory of their actions. The CIA administered LSD to unwitting subjects, including civilians in bars and restaurants, just to observe the effects. They conducted experiments on prisoners, mental patients, and soldiers who couldn't refuse. They hired doctors and universities to perform research without telling subjects they were part of a CIA program. One scientist, Frank Olson, allegedly committed suicide by jumping from a window after being dosed with LSD without his knowledge. His family believes he was murdered. The experiments included prolonged sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and the use of paralytic drugs while playing recorded messages for weeks. One technique involved putting people in drug-induced comas for months while playing repeated audio messages, attempting to erase existing memories and implant new ones. Some subjects experienced permanent psychological damage, memory loss, personality changes, psychosis. Lives destroyed for research that the CIA's own documents admitted produced no reliable results. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKUltra files destroyed. But some documents survived, and in 1977, Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the program's existence. Congressional hearings followed, exposing the scope of the abuse. The disturbing part isn't just what happened, it's that MKUltra was vast, 149 subprojects involving at least 80 institutions and 185 researchers. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was systematic, funded, and approved at the highest levels. And we only know about MKUltra because some documents survived. How many other projects were successfully destroyed? What's still classified? What techniques developed in MKUltra are still being used? Unit 731. During World War II, while the world's attention focused on Nazi atrocities, an equally horrific operation unfolded in occupied China. Unit 731 was a covert biological and chemical warfare research division of the Imperial Japanese Army, led by microbiologist Shiro Ishii. What happened there represents some of the most disturbing experimentation in human history. Researchers conducted vivisections on living prisoners without anesthesia to study disease progression. They deliberately infected people with plague, cholera, and other diseases, then documented the effects. They performed frostbite experiments by freezing limbs and testing revival methods. They tested biological weapons on villages, releasing plague-infected fleas and contaminated food supplies to observe outbreak patterns. Conservative estimates suggest at least 10,000 people died in these experiments, though the true number may be much higher. The subjects were primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, along with Russians, Koreans, and others labeled as logs by the researchers, dehumanized to make the experiments psychologically easier to perform. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Unit 731 destroyed most of its facilities and evidence. But here's where the story becomes even darker. The United States granted immunity to Unit 731 researchers in exchange for their data. General Douglas MacArthur and the American occupation government decided the biological warfare research was too valuable to lose to Soviet hands. So they made a deal. No war crimes prosecution in exchange for the research data. Shiro Ishii and most of his team went free. Some even received funding to continue research. The United States gained data that couldn't be replicated ethically, information about disease progression, human tolerance limits, and biological weapon effectiveness based on lethal human experimentation. This data allegedly informed American biological warfare programs for decades. Japan officially acknowledged Unit 731's existence in the 1990s, but has never issued a full apology. The researchers who escaped prosecution lived normal lives. Some became respected scientists and professors. The victims were forgotten. Unit 731 represents the horrifying intersection of military necessity and the abandonment of all ethical constraints. And the decision to grant immunity reveals how easily governments prioritize strategic advantage over justice. The Stanford Prison Experiment, August 1971. Stanford University psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to study how people behave in positions of power and powerlessness. He created a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building and recruited 24 male students as volunteers. Randomly, participants were assigned to be either prisoners or guards. The guards received uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. The prisoners were arrested at their homes by real police, fingerprinted, and given prison uniforms. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It lasted 6 days. And in those 6 days, ordinary college students transformed into abusive authoritarians and traumatized victims. The guards began with mild enforcement of rules. Within days, they were conducting psychological torture. They forced prisoners to do humiliating exercises, to clean toilets with their bare hands, to endure solitary confinement in a closet. They stripped prisoners naked, made them perform simulated sexual acts, and denied them sleep. The prisoners initially resisted, then broke down. One prisoner had to be released after 36 hours due to acute emotional disturbance. Others showed signs of extreme stress, anxiety, and depression. Several completely internalized their prisoner role, accepting abuse as normal. Zimbardo himself became absorbed in his role as prison superintendent, focusing on maintaining control rather than ensuring participant welfare. The experiment only ended when his girlfriend, Christina Maslach, visited the facility and was horrified by what she saw. She convinced him to stop. The experiment became famous as proof that situations, not individual character, determine behavior. Good people will do terrible things if given power and the right environment. The results were cited in understanding everything from Abu Ghraib to police brutality. But recent investigations have revealed problems. Some guards later admitted they were acting based on what they thought Zimbardo wanted. Prisoners reported feeling they couldn't leave, even though they'd been told they could. The experiment may have been less about natural behavior and more about demand characteristics and coercion. Nevertheless, the Stanford prison experiment revealed something disturbing about human nature: how quickly authority corrupts and how easily people rationalize cruelty when systems legitimize it. The Milgram shock experiment, 1961. Yale University. Stanley Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary Germans could participate in the Holocaust. His answer terrified the world. The setup seemed straightforward. Volunteers were told they were participating in a memory study. They were assigned the role of teacher. Another person, supposedly a fellow volunteer, but actually an actor, was the learner. The teacher would read word pairs. When the learner made a mistake, the teacher would administer an electric shock, increasing the voltage with each error. The shocks started at 15 volts and went up to 450 volts, clearly labeled with warnings like danger, severe shock, and XXX. The learner was strapped to a chair in another room. As the voltage increased, the learner would grunt, then scream, then beg to be released, then eventually fall silent, suggesting unconsciousness or worse. But here's the key: there were no real shocks. The learner was acting. The experiment wasn't about memory, it was about obedience. When the teacher hesitated, the experimenter would calmly insist, "Please continue." The experiment requires that you continue. You have no choice, you must go on. Milgram predicted that only a tiny fraction of people would go all the way to 450 volts. He was wrong. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. They sweated, trembled, argued with the experimenter, and expressed distress, but they obeyed. This wasn't just a few sadists. This was two-thirds of ordinary people willing to potentially kill a stranger because an authority figure in a lab coat told them to. Milgram's conclusion was chilling. The key to atrocity isn't evil individuals. It's ordinary people following orders. The Nazi defense of, "I was just following orders," wasn't an excuse. It was an accurate description of how most people behave under authority. The experiment was controversial immediately. Some participants experienced severe emotional distress when they learned what they'd done. Many reported lasting psychological effects: shame, guilt, damaged self-image. The experiment arguably inflicted trauma on subjects to prove they were capable of inflicting trauma. But it revealed a fundamental truth. Under the right conditions, most people will do horrifying things, not because they're evil, but because they've been taught to obey authority. And that might be the most disturbing discovery of all. The Little Albert Experiment, 1920, Johns Hopkins University. Behavioral psychologist John Watson wanted to prove that emotions, particularly fear, could be conditioned. His subject was a 9-month-old infant named Albert B. Watson. Exposed Albert to various stimuli: a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, cotton wool, burning newspaper. Albert showed no fear. He was a calm, normal baby. Then Watson began the conditioning. Every time Albert reached for the white rat, Watson struck a steel bar with a hammer behind the child's head, creating a loud, terrifying noise. Albert would cry in fear. This was repeated over and over. After several pairings, Albert became terrified of the rat, even without the noise. Just seeing the rat made him cry and try to crawl away. But the conditioning went further. Albert began showing fear of anything white and furry: a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, even a Santa Claus mask with a white beard. Watson had successfully conditioned a phobia in an infant. He'd proved that fears could be learned, but he never deconditioned Albert. The experiment ended, and Albert was removed from the hospital before Watson could reverse the effects. We don't know what happened to Albert. He left the study with conditioned phobias that may have lasted his entire life. Decades later, researchers identified him as Douglas Merritt, a child who died at age 6 from hydrocephalus. Others believe Albert was actually William Barger, who lived to 2007 and had a lifelong fear of dogs. Either way, Watson deliberately traumatized an infant for research and never attempted to undo the damage. By modern standards, this is unconscionable. At the time, it made Watson famous and helped establish behaviorism as a dominant psychological theory. The Little Albert experiment proved that fears could be conditioned, but it also demonstrated how easily researchers could cause lasting harm to vulnerable subjects in the name of scientific progress. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932 to 1972, 40 years. The United States Public Health Service conducted one of the most shameful experiments in American medical history. The study began in Macon County, Alabama. Researchers recruited 600 black men, 399 with latent syphilis, and 201 without. The men were told they were receiving free health care for bad blood, a local term for various ailments. They were never told they had syphilis. They were never offered treatment, even after penicillin became the standard cure in 1947. For 40 years, researchers tracked the progression of untreated syphilis, observing how the disease destroyed the men's bodies. Syphilis is devastating if untreated. It causes neurological damage, blindness, paralysis, heart disease, dementia, and death. The men in the study experienced all of this while doctors watched and took notes. When participants tried to enlist in World War II, researchers intervened to prevent them from receiving the mandatory syphilis treatment given to soldiers. When other health programs offered treatment, the study coordinators ensured participants didn't receive it. The men were used. They thought they were receiving health care. Instead, they were guinea pigs in a study that treated their suffering as data points. Many died from syphilis or related complications. Their wives contracted the disease. Their children were born with congenital syphilis. The study only ended in 1972, after a whistleblower leaked the story to the press. Public outrage forced the government to shut it down. In 1997, President Clinton formally apologized. Survivors received financial settlements and lifetime medical care. But the damage went far beyond the participants. The Tuskegee study destroyed trust in medical institutions within Black communities, contributing to health disparities that persist today. When people refuse vaccines or distrust doctors, this is part of why. The government conducted a lethal experiment on Black men for 4 decades. The Tuskegee study revealed that medical ethics could be completely abandoned when researchers viewed subjects as less than human. And it showed that institutions could perpetuate atrocity for generations through bureaucratic inertia and racist indifference. The Monster Study, 1939, University of Iowa. Speech pathologist Wendell Johnson wanted to prove his theory about stuttering, that it was a learned behavior caused by negative reinforcement rather than a biological condition. His student, Mary Tudor, conducted the experiment on 22 orphan children at the Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home. The children were divided into groups. Some stuttered naturally, others had normal speech. The experiment's goal was to induce stuttering in children who spoke normally by constantly criticizing their speech. Tudor told these children that their speech was defective, that they were beginning to stutter, and that they should be ashamed. She interrupted them constantly, corrected every imperfection, and created an environment of relentless criticism. The results were devastating. Children with normal speech began showing signs of speech anxiety. They became hesitant, self-conscious, refused to speak. Some developed speech problems that lasted their entire lives. The children who already stuttered received positive reinforcement and showed improvement, but the children subjected to negative reinforcement experienced lasting psychological harm. Some never recovered their confidence in speaking. Johnson never published the study. He knew what he'd done was wrong. The research was nicknamed the Monster Study by his colleagues, a reference to the monstrous ethics violation it represented. The experiment remained largely unknown until 2001, when a journalist uncovered it. By then, many of the subjects were elderly or deceased. The University of Iowa apologized in 2001. In 2007, the university paid $925,000 to settle lawsuits from survivors. The Monster Study proved that psychological damage could be inflicted through words alone. It demonstrated the power of negative reinforcement, but it did so by deliberately harming children who had no ability to consent or defend themselves. Wendell Johnson knew it was wrong. That's why he never published. But he did it anyway, and those children paid the price for his theory. The Russian sleep experiment. This one occupies a strange space between documented history and urban legend. According to the story, in the 1940s, Soviet researchers conducted an experiment on 5 political prisoners, promising freedom if they endured 30 days without sleep. The subjects were sealed in a chamber and exposed to an experimental gas that eliminated the need for sleep. For the first 5 days, everything seemed normal. Then the behavior changed. The subjects stopped talking to researchers. They began whispering to each other, covering the observation windows. By day 9, screaming began. Then silence. When researchers checked the chamber on day 15, they found a scene of horror. The subjects had torn apart the books and furniture. They'd smeared pages over the windows with their own feces, and they'd mutilated themselves, removing chunks of flesh and muscle, exposing bones. When researchers tried to remove them, the subjects resisted violently, begging to remain in the chamber. They claimed they needed to stay awake. One allegedly said, "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all." Most historians and researchers believe this story is a creepypasta, an internet horror legend with no factual basis. No credible evidence exists. The Russian government has no records of such an experiment. The story first appeared on creepypasta forums in 2010. But here's why it persists. Because it's plausible. We know the Soviet Union conducted extreme human experiments during the Cold War. We know sleep deprivation was used as torture. We know governments prioritized military research over human rights. The Russian sleep experiment might be fiction, but it reflects real fears about what governments might do in secret. And even if this specific experiment never happened, similar ones did. The CIA's MKUltra program included sleep deprivation experiments. Prisoners in Soviet gulags were subjected to intentional sleep deprivation as punishment. The story endures because it represents a deeper truth. The line between science and torture can disappear when secrecy, authority, and national security override ethics. And we may never know everything that was done in the name of research behind closed doors. 10 experiments, some documented, some alleged, some that cross the line from history into legend, but all reveal the same disturbing pattern. When ethics are abandoned, when ends are believed to justify means, when subjects are dehumanized, human beings are capable of inflicting unimaginable harm.